The document made a dry, clean sound when my stepmother slid it across the polished dining table. My father's memorial dinner was not over. His friends were still in the hallway with their coffee cups, speaking quietly about what a kind man he had been. The plates had not been cleared. The candles were still burning. And Pamela was standing at the head of the table in black silk and pearls, clearing her throat in a way that stopped every conversation at once. "I think we should address something while we're all together," she said. Her voice was calm and measured, the voice of someone doing an unpleasant thing they have convinced themselves is necessary. She placed a folder on the table and slid a document toward the family lawyer, Mr. Albright, who received it with an expression I could not read. Then she looked at me. "For clarity," she said, "and to avoid confusion later, I want to be transparent." She paused. "Caroline will no longer be included in the will." My aunt made a sound. My cousin looked at his plate. My face went hot. "My name is Caroline Mercer." And that was the moment I realized my father's death was not the worst thing that would happen to me that week. Nobody argued. Nobody pushed their chair back and said that this was wrong. My uncle stared at the center of the table like it had suddenly become very interesting. My aunt had the expression of someone who wanted to speak and had decided the cost was too high. Mr. Albright shifted in his seat and looked at the document rather than at me or at Pamela. And the silence stretched, filled with the sounds of people choosing not to act, cutlery settling, someone in the hallway saying something and trailing off, the distant sound of a car outside. I sat very still. The hot feeling in my face had moved into my chest and settled there, heavy and specific. "This was updated recently," Pamela said into the silence. Her tone was gentle, as though she were explaining a schedule change. Not erasing someone from the legal record of their own father's life. Not doing it at a memorial dinner while his friends were still in the next room. "Is this happening right now?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Pamela nodded. "It's better to be transparent," she said. Transparent. She said it like she was being generous. Like removing me from the will was actually a gift because at least she wasn't hiding it. "My name is Caroline Mercer, and I am my father's only biological daughter." Before that dinner I still had a claim to what he left behind, not just money, not just property, but the documented acknowledgement that I had been part of his life and that he had meant to take care of me. After that dinner, according to the document Pamela had placed on the table, I was not included anymore. She had not reduced what I would receive or delayed it. She had removed me entirely. And she had done it at his memorial dinner, in front of his friends and relatives, because she understood something I was still learning. That public humiliation is a form of control. If I objected in that room, I would look emotional and ungrateful. If I stayed quiet, I had accepted it. She had built a situation with no good exit. That was Pamela's gift. She did not operate through cruelty that was obvious. She built situations in advance where every door led where she wanted. My father had been inside one of those situations for years. It had taken me until the night of his memorial to understand just how long. My father remarried when I was 19. I was away at college. He called to tell me about Pamela and I could hear how happy he was, and I remember deciding, very deliberately, to be glad for him. Pamela was elegant, soft-spoken, and attentive to my father in ways that I knew he valued. She was also, I noticed at the first family dinner, very precise about things. The kind of precise that looks like attention to detail until you realize it is something else. She had moved the seating arrangement without being asked. She had told a version of a family story I had always known differently, and when I corrected it, gently, she smiled and said, "Oh, Caroline, you always remember things so dramatically." My father laughed. Not unkindly. Just the reflexive laugh of a man who was enjoying his evening and did not want a small disagreement to interrupt it. I remember looking at my plate and deciding to let it go. That decision, let it go, don't start anything, just get through the meal, became the decision I made at every family gathering for the next several years. It happened so gradually that I did not notice, for a long time, that I had stopped making any other kind. Pamela took over the architecture of the family's life slowly enough that each individual change felt minor. She managed the holidays first, the menus, the timing, who was invited to what. Then she managed the family vacations, the gathering schedule, the seating at important dinners. My father, who had always run a fairly loose household where these things organized themselves naturally, seemed relieved to have someone handling the details. He was a man who was good at love but not particularly good at logistics, and Pamela was extraordinary at logistics. What I did not understand at first was that logistics are power. Who sits where, who is consulted, whose opinion is sought, these are not neutral decisions. They are the infrastructure of belonging. And Pamela was building that infrastructure around herself, methodically, one small decision at a time. By the time I was in my mid-20s and coming home for holidays, I had noticed that nobody asked me much anymore. Not about my preferences, not about my plans, not about what I thought of decisions being made. It was easier to consult Pamela. It had always been easier to consult Pamela. And I had, without entirely realizing it, become a guest in what had once been my own family. My father was not a bad man. I need to say that clearly, because the story is easier to tell if he is a villain, and he was not. He was a man who loved peace more than confrontation and who trusted the people close to him to manage smaller things while he focused on what he considered important. He was generous and warm and present in the ways that mattered most to him. He just did not understand that the smaller things were not small. When Pamela and I disagreed, about the house, about money, about what he had told me versus what she said he had told her, my father's resolution was always the path that ended the argument fastest. That path was always Pamela's path. Not because he didn't love me. I believe he loved me completely. But somewhere in the calculus of daughter and wife, he had decided his daughter was strong enough to absorb disappointment and his wife was not. What he did not see was how much of that absorbing I had been quietly doing for years, and what it had steadily cost me across all those years of choosing to make peace instead of making my position known. The biggest shift happened over the house. My father had bought it when I was 3 years old. I grew up in every room of it. My height was marked on the doorframe of the kitchen pantry in pencil. Small Caroline, medium Caroline, teenage Caroline, and then a note my father had added when I came home from my first year of college that said still growing in his handwriting. After Pamela moved in, the house changed gradually in the way that houses change when someone new inhabits them, new furniture, new arrangements, small renovations that were individually reasonable. What changed more significantly was the language. Pamela began referring to it as my house in conversations where that word did the most work, when speaking to her own friends, when managing contractors, when explaining decisions to relatives who deferred to her on matters of the home. My father did not correct it. He may not have noticed it. But I noticed. And the distance between our house and her house was, I understood, not a minor grammatical distinction. It was a declaration that was being made slowly and repeatedly, in small enough increments that no individual instance was worth addressing. Until it was. One afternoon in the second year of my father's illness, I was sitting in the kitchen when I heard Pamela on the phone in the next room. Her voice was low but the house was quiet enough to carry it. Things should be simplified, she was saying. It doesn't have to be complicated. A pause. The family needs clarity. I sat without moving. I heard her mention a meeting, something about paperwork, and then the call ended and she came into the kitchen with her composed expression and asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes. I sat at the kitchen table while she made it and thought about what I had just heard. That evening I raised it carefully with my father, not describing what I had overheard, just asking about his plans. He smiled and patted my hand. Caroline will always be taken care of, he said. His voice was warm and completely certain, the voice of a man who believed what he was saying without qualification. I held on to that sentence for a long time afterward, turning it over the way you turn over something you are not yet sure how to read. I was still holding it the night Pamela read the will, trying to understand what it had meant. My father had his diagnosis 14 months before he passed. A degenerative condition that moved faster than any of us had been told to expect. In the first months after the diagnosis, the household restructured itself around his care in ways that felt natural and necessary. Pamela stepped into every practical gap: doctor's appointments, medication management, communication with specialists, financial decisions that needed to be made during a period when my father's energy was limited. I was living 2 hours away and working, and the distance felt enormous in a way it never had before. I drove home as often as I could. I called every day. And Pamela was always there. Between me and my father in the practical sense, managing the calendar, letting me know when he was resting, when he was having a difficult day, when a visit might be too much. I told myself this was what caregiving looked like and that I should be grateful someone was present and capable. I was grateful. I was also, slowly and without being able to name it, being moved to the outside of my father's life during the time when being on the inside mattered most. Every visit was shorter. Every phone call was briefer. And the explanation was always the same: he needs his rest. When I asked Pamela about my father's medical situation, the actual treatment plan, the prognosis beyond the initial diagnosis, she said he was stable and the doctors were managing it. When I asked about speaking directly with his physician, she said it would only worry him if he found out I had been making calls. When I asked about his finances, specifically the trust my grandfather had established, she said it was handled and I didn't need to concern myself. Each answer was delivered in the same measured, caring tone. Each one closed a door. I began keeping a list in a notebook: dates, what I had asked, what she had said, what access I had attempted and what had prevented it. When I read it back, the pattern was undeniable. I had been systematically excluded from every piece of information that would have let me advocate for myself or my father. It had been done carefully and reasonably, with patience. And by the time I saw it clearly, there was almost no time left. What I did not know then was that my father had seen the same pattern before I had, and had done something about it quietly, in a way that would not become visible until after he was gone. 2 months before my father died, Pamela was away for 3 days visiting her sister, and I drove out to stay with him. It was the longest uninterrupted time I had spent with him in nearly a year. He was visibly tired, the kind that lives in the body and does not fully lift with rest. But his mind was clear and present, and we talked the way we used to talk, at the kitchen table with tea. He told me about things he had been thinking about the early years, about my mother, about decisions he was glad of. At one point he held my hand across the table. "No matter what happens after I'm gone," he said, "I need you to know that I love you. And that I made sure of it." I thought he was talking about our relationship. I told him I knew. I told him I loved him. He nodded. "It gets complicated," he said. "But you're taken care of." I drove home that evening with his voice sitting in me like something I was meant to hold. I just did not yet understand what he had been telling me, or how carefully he had ensured I would eventually find out. And so I arrived at the memorial dinner as I described at the beginning. Grief hollowed and uncertain, sitting at my father's table in my father's house while his friends stood in the hallway saying kind things about him, and Pamela arranged her document into the most public presentation she could have designed. The room was full of people who had been hearing her version of me for years. Caroline is sensitive. Caroline tends to make things difficult. Caroline has always had trouble accepting how things are. The announcement was not purely a legal act. It was the final paragraph of a story Pamela had been writing since she arrived in our family, a story in which I was a difficult, ungrateful outsider rather than my father's daughter, and in which she was the patient, devoted wife managing the chaos I produced. She needed witnesses to that version of things, because witnesses make a version stick. She had designed the setting, the timing, and the audience. What she had not accounted for, in all of her careful preparation, was the possibility that my father had also been preparing. That while she was building her version of things, he had been quietly building the answer to it, and had left it with someone she trusted with her own arrangements. My uncle spoke first. His name is Arthur, and he is my father's older brother, and he is not a man who raises his voice. He said, quietly and clearly, "Your father always intended for Caroline to be provided for." He told me so directly, more than once. Pamela turned toward him with an expression of practiced sorrow. "He changed his mind," she said. "I know that's hard to hear, Arthur." My uncle looked at her for a long moment without responding. Then he looked at Mr. Albright. The lawyer cleared his throat and said the document was recent and appeared to be properly executed. He did not say anything beyond that. I watched my uncle absorb the situation. Pamela's composure, the lawyer's neutrality, the document in front of him, and I watched him decide he did not have enough to fight it in this room, tonight. That decision felt like another door closing. What I did not know, sitting at that table with my hands in my lap and everything held carefully still, was that there was a different door entirely. One my father had quietly opened 6 months earlier, from a room Pamela had never been in. I stood slowly. "I think I should go," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Pamela nodded with the gracious, sorrowful expression she had maintained all evening. "That's probably best," she said. "Take care of yourself." My aunt started to rise, but I shook my head, small enough that only she could see it. I didn't want comfort in that room. I got my coat and walked out the front door and stood in the driveway in the cold night air, and I stood there for a moment. I thought about my father's voice at that kitchen table 2 months before he died. "It gets complicated, but you're taken care of." I had understood those words as reassurance, the general kind, the kind a father uses to mean don't worry, everything will be fine. Standing in that driveway, I started to hear them differently. "You're taken care of" was not the same as "you'll be all right." It was specific. It was past tense in a way that only made sense if something concrete had already been done. Not comfort, information. And standing in that cold driveway, I was beginning, for the first time, to feel the difference between those two things. The call came 2 days later. I was at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I had not drunk, staring at nothing in particular, going through the surface motions of daily life while the deeper parts of me were still sitting in that dining room. My phone rang with a number I recognized as Mr. Albright's office. I answered immediately. He said he needed to apologize for what had happened at the dinner, not in a way that suggested wrongdoing on his part, but in the way of a professional person who is genuinely uncomfortable with the circumstances they found themselves in and wished they had handled something differently. Then he paused. "There is something you should know," he said. "Something that was not presented at the dinner, and should have been handled before it got to that point." His voice had a careful, measured quality, not secretive, but deliberate. "Your father made arrangements that were separate from the main will," he said. "Arrangements that Pamela was not informed of." He paused. "Can you come to my office? Tomorrow, if possible." I said yes before he finished the sentence. I sat with the phone in my hand afterward, thinking about my father and about what I made sure of it had really meant. Mr. Albright's office was quiet and organized, the kind of space that communicates seriousness through its tidiness. He sat across from me and placed a sealed envelope on the desk between us. The envelope was cream-colored and heavy, sealed with wax, and my name was written on the front in my father's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. I had seen that handwriting on birthday cards and notes tucked into packages for years. "Your father brought this to me personally," Mr. Albright said, approximately 6 months before he passed. "He gave me specific instructions about when it was to be opened and in whose presence." He folded his hands on the desk. "He asked me not to mention it unless the circumstances required." He looked at me. "They require it." I reached for the envelope and stopped myself. "What is it?" I asked. "A supplemental estate directive," he said. "Executed after the main will, which means it takes legal precedence on the matters it addresses." He paused. "It addresses several matters." I sat in the chair across from him and felt something shift in my chest, not relief, not yet, but the first tentative sense that the story was not over. That there was more of it, and my father had written it. Inside the envelope was a 2-page document, formally typed, signed and witnessed, with my father's signature at the bottom of each page. Beneath it was a letter on the cream stationery he had used for as long as I could remember. It began, "My daughter." I had to stop reading. My daughter. Not Caroline. Just what I was to him. I took a breath and kept going. He wrote that he had loved Pamela and did not regret the years together, but that in his final months he had become aware of things that disturbed him. He wrote that he lacked the energy to address them directly, that confronting her in his condition would have cost more than he had left. But he could not leave without making sure I was protected. He had watched me shrink for years trying to keep the peace, and he was sorry he had allowed it, and the document I was holding was his way of putting on the record what he had always intended. And then he wrote the same words from our last real conversation. I made sure of it. Sitting in that office with the letter in my hands, I finally understood what he had meant. The supplemental directive's most significant provision was this. The main will Pamela had presented was valid on its own terms, but the directive superseded it on the question of the family estate trust, the trust holding the house, the majority of the family's assets, and the structure my grandfather had built. The main will transferred control of that trust to Pamela. The directive transferred it to me. It was not punitive. Pamela retained the financial accounts, a portion of the liquid assets, and the right to reside in the house for 2 years. But the trust was mine. Mr. Albright explained it carefully, anticipating he would need to do so more than once. He also told me the directive required one thing before it could take full effect. It had to be read aloud in the presence of the entire family, in exactly the same manner the original will had been presented. My father had written that requirement himself, in his own words, at the bottom of the directive. He had understood that public humiliation requires a public correction. He had wanted an audience for his version, the same way Pamela had wanted one for hers, and he had made sure, with characteristic patience, that his would arrive last. The condition was written in my father's own words. It is my specific wish that this document be read aloud in the presence of the family members present at the reading of the main will, so that there is no ambiguity about my intentions and no possibility that any individual member receives a different account than any other. He had understood, from wherever he was when he wrote this, that the main will would be used the way it was used, publicly, deliberately, in front of witnesses. He had built the answer to it with the same architecture. He had designed a room and an audience and a moment, exactly as Pamela had. And he had been patient enough, and strategic enough, to make sure that room got built. Mr. Albright said he would contact Pamela and Arthur and the other family members who had been present. He would not tell Pamela the content, only that an additional document required the family's attention. I thought about her face when she walked in. I thought about my father's handwriting on the envelope. When can we schedule it? I asked. Mr. Albright reached for his calendar. My father had built this room and arranged these pieces. All I had to do was walk into it. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, 10 days after the memorial dinner. Pamela arrived before I did. When I walked in, she was seated at the same table, in the same chair, with the composed expression of a woman who has already decided how the meeting will go. She was wearing a different version of the same outfit. Dark, appropriate, dignified. My Uncle Arthur was there. My Aunt Constance. 2 cousins. A few of my father's friends who had been at the dinner and received Mr. Albright's call. Pamela looked at me as I sat down with something that was trying to be sympathy and landing closer to condescension. I hope this will bring you some closure, she said quietly. I thought about my father's letter. I thought about the 2 pages of the directive with his signature at the bottom of each one. I looked at her and felt something unfamiliar, not anger, not the familiar accommodation and shrinking, but the opposite of those things. I felt still. I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like my father's daughter, not the difficult one Pamela had described to everyone, but the one he had written a letter to and sealed in an envelope with specific instructions for exactly this moment. Mr. Albright placed the sealed envelope on the table. The cream-colored envelope, the wax seal, my name in my father's handwriting visible from across the table. Pamela's eyes went to it immediately, and something moved across her face that she controlled quickly but not completely. This document, Mr. Albright said, was executed by Edward Mercer 6 months prior to his passing. It is a supplemental estate directive, and under the terms of the estate it takes legal precedence over the provisions it addresses in the main will. He paused. I am going to read it aloud, as Mr. Mercer specifically requested. Pamela's composure had not broken, but its quality had changed. Her hands moved to the table. Why wasn't this presented at the first meeting? She asked. Mr. Albright looked at her. Because it required the full family to be present, he said, and that condition hadn't been met until now. He opened the envelope. The room was very quiet. Arthur looked at me. I looked at my father's signature on the first page, the clear, strong signature I had seen on birthday cards my whole life, and held very still, and let the document do what my father had prepared it to do. Mr. Albright read for approximately 8 minutes. He read the formal provisions first, the legal language about precedence and execution and the specific assets addressed. And then he read the section my father had written himself, the portion that was not legal boilerplate but my father's actual voice in the room, speaking in clear and measured sentences about what he had observed, what he had come to understand, and what he wanted the family to know. He had written about his illness and about what the final months had looked like from the inside. He had written about decisions that had been made without his full knowledge. He had written that he had come to believe his daughter had been systematically excluded from information she had a right to, and from access to him that she had a right to, and that this had not been accidental. He had not written Pamela's name in accusation. He had simply described what he had seen and asked the family to draw their own conclusions. And then he had transferred the estate trust to me. The room was silent when Mr. Albright finished. Pamela said, very quietly, "This can't be right." Arthur looked at her. My Aunt Constance looked at her hands. Two of my father's friends stood and left without speaking. The silence after Mr. Albright finished lasted long enough to become its own event. Pamela recovered first, quickly and with direction. "There must be a challenge process," she said. Her voice was controlled but thinner than usual. "Documents of this nature can be contested." Mr. Albright said that was correct, but that this directive had been executed with 3 witnesses, a notary, and a co-signatory attorney, and that its validity was procedurally sound. Any challenge, he said, would need to address the substance. Pamela looked at the document. Then at me. And for the first time in all the years I had known her, I saw something behind her composure that had not been there before. Not anger. Something more like the expression of a person who has played a very careful long game and has just understood that the other person had been playing too. She had assumed my father was not paying attention during those final months. She had been wrong. He had been paying the most careful attention of all. He had simply chosen his moment, the same way she had chosen hers, and had written his conclusion into a document that would remain long after he was gone. My father did not just protect my inheritance. That is what I kept returning to in the days and weeks after the meeting, as the legal process moved forward and Pamela began her quiet retreat. He had done something more than protect money or property. He had put his version of events on the record. In a room full of witnesses, with his signature on each page, he had said, "I saw what was happening. I knew my daughter was being pushed out. I did not abandon her and I want everyone in this room to know it." That was the gift. Not the trust or the house, though those things mattered. The gift was being believed. His voice arriving in the room after he was gone to say the thing I had needed him to say while he was still here. When I walked out of Mr. Albright's office that afternoon, I cried in my car for a long time. Not only from grief, from the specific relief of a person who has carried something alone for a very long time and has finally, in a room full of witnesses, been told by the person who mattered most, "I know. I saw what was happening. It was real, and I prepared for it." Pamela left the house 6 months later. She did not leave dramatically. She arranged for her things to be moved on a weekday morning when I was not present. Her way of maintaining whatever version of dignity was still available to her. She retained what my father had left her, the accounts, the portion of the liquid assets. It was not nothing. My father had not been vindictive and neither was I. But the house was mine. The trust was mine. The management of what my father had spent his life building was mine. And the family, Arthur, Constance, the cousins and friends who had sat in that room and heard my father's letter read aloud, understood now what the years had actually looked like. Not because I had argued or insisted, but because my father had done it for me, in his own voice, in a document prepared in secret and delivered with precision. The people who try hardest to erase you tend to underestimate the one thing they cannot control. The record that remains when someone who loved you took care to leave it behind. My father understood that. He had simply waited, with more patience than I knew he had, to prove it.